research director in the clinical assessment group at Pearson, has worked with culturally and linguistically diverse children as a speech-language pathologist for over 17 years. Mary has worked on the PLS-5 Spanish and PLS-5 English and Spanish reading tests. Nancy Castilleja is a senior product manager at Pearson Assessment. Prior to this role, Nancy was a senior research director at Harcourt Assessment, working with authors to develop preschool assessments PLS-3 and PLS-4, and Spanish assessments PLS for Spanish, CELF for Spanish. Nancy has experience working with children and adults in community and school settings. She has presented at state and national conferences on the early childhood assessments and bilingual assessment issues.
Good morning to everyone. I guess in some places it's afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Before we start, we need to go through the disclosures required by ASHA. Both Marie Sepulveda and I are employees of Pearson Assessment, and Pearson Assessment publishes the PLS-5. Today's presentation is related specifically to dual language scoring for PLS-5, and we will not be discussing other Spanish assessments. If you are an ASHA member and registered in the ASHA CEU registry, you can obtain 0.1 CEUs by listening to today's live presentation if you are on the line for the entire hour. If you are listening to the recorded webinar, no CEUs are available. If you're participating in this webinar as a group, it's important that each member of the group who wants CEUs sign the roster that was provided with your other materials and submit those. All right, now that we've taken care of that part, let's get started. In this hour, we're going to do a quick overview about assessing bilingual children, talk about the dual language approach to language assessment. We're going to talk some about our data collection and research results because this will really help you determine whether the child that you're testing is an appropriate candidate for PLS-5 Spanish or if he should be tested with the English edition. Go over the research results, which will also help you in your interpretation, and then have some time for questions and answers. Certainly, throughout the session today, you can submit questions on chat, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. I think probably most of the people on the line are already familiar with the idea that the concern about testing children who are bilingual comes from often a high rate of over-identification, misidentification of children as having a language disorder when many of these children actually are exhibiting normal phenomena associated with learning a second language. So it's been typical in the past that children who are minority or limited English proficient children are identified as having a disability. For clinicians who aren't familiar with what's typical for a child acquiring a second language, normal bilingual phenomena can look very similar to the characteristics of a child with a disorder. And here we provided a short list. This isn't a complete list of typical characteristics of bilingual speakers in the U.S. So we won't go through those because this is really typical of what you might see in many presentations on bilingualism and second language acquisition. But it's really just here as a reminder that a lot of the phenomena that you would see in a monolingual child that might be indicative of a disorder is really just typical of a child who's learning a second language. Because many clinicians are not familiar with these bilingual phenomena, bilingual children are misdiagnosed because the child is tested in both Spanish and English, but they get low scores on both tests. There's been a lot in the literature about conceptual scoring, which talks about taking into account the meaning of the child's response regardless of what language the response is produced. So Barbara Pearson and her colleagues in 1993 first started talking about this in the context of vocabulary acquisition. Since then, Elizabeth Pena and Lisa Vidora and their colleagues have done a lot of work in the area of semantics, looking at conceptual scoring and reporting that bilingual children certainly would benefit from conceptual scoring. They looked at a lot of different methods for combining scores across languages, and they found that definitely appropriate classification of a child with a disorder can be more accurate when both English and Spanish abilities are taken into account. So why haven't we done this sooner? It's really been kind of a bear for us to figure out exactly how to collect that data and how to report it. On PLS, we don't talk about conceptual scoring per se. We refer to PLS scoring as a dual language score because the literature's basis was looking at vocabulary development and conceptual scoring. On PLS 5 Spanish, we're looking at semantics, but we're also applying conceptual scoring to morphosyntactic skills and early academic skills. So it's a little bit broader because PLS 5 specifically is a broad developmental assessment. A lot of research needed to be done before we settled on a process for dual language assessment. And the research steps that we took to determine if this really did provide a valid representation of a bilingual child's skills included a pilot study that we did with PLS 4 Spanish and 2 studies done with PLS 5 Spanish, the bilingual tryout study and the bilingual standardization study. So I'm going to go over those because you'll see that there were a lot of choices that we had to make and decisions we had to make about the process and the scoring procedure. Our first study was done about 3 years ago with the PLS 4 Spanish. And before we started this pilot, we put together an expert panel that included Dr. Hortensia Kaiser, Anrit Langdon, and Elizabeth Pena, and talked with them about what might be the best way to set up the procedure for a bilingual assessment. Lots of pros and cons, different ways. We knew that a lot of clinicians, when testing children, would want to maybe administer an item in Spanish, and if the child didn't know the item, go right to an item in English. And there were lots of concerns about the effects of doing that, letting the child know essentially that he had missed that item right away so that he might change his answer on the English for the English administration. And just the fact that you were going back and forth between languages quite a bit. So what we decided on after talking with them is to take the PLS 4 Spanish English. We developed an English form supplement. So we took the PLS 4 Spanish, translated the items into English that worked fine in Spanish, and administered the Spanish to participants, the PLS 4 Spanish to the participants of the pilot study. The procedure that we used is administering all the items in Spanish first, obtaining a ceiling, and then going back and re-administering the items in English. This study was fairly small. There were 28 children in the study, ranging from almost 4 to age 6. And we did make sure that we got children from different areas who would speak a version of Spanish that would be typical in Mexico, from the Caribbean, and Central and South America. Almost 40% of the children in this study had parents who had an education level of 11th grade or less. What we routinely do on our Spanish test is we look at 3 areas. To determine fluency in Spanish, we ask someone to rate the child's exposure to Spanish, their language comprehension skills, and their expressive language skills. So for exposure to Spanish in this study, the children either had a primary caregiver who spoke Spanish to the child all the time. The child was reported to be Spanish-English bilingual by the parents, and the child could be enrolled in bilingual classes. Their comprehension skills, they needed to understand Spanish well. So if they understood only a little Spanish and mostly English, or understood no Spanish at all, they were not included in the bilingual pilot study. Same thing for the expressive language. If they spoke a little Spanish, they were not included in this study. What we found with this study of 28 children was that 93% of the children did get additional score points on the auditory comprehension subtest. The score difference ranged from 0 points, so some children did not get additional points in English, but it ranged all the way up to 6 additional standard score points in English with an average of 3 extra points. 75% of these kids got additional points on the expressive communication subtest, and that mean was about the same of 3 extra points, although you see that the score range was really quite wide. Some children obtained all the way up to 13 points, but that was uncommon. And 32% of the sample earned scores that would have moved them from a language disordered range of performance to a typically developing range. So especially if they were had borderline disordered skills, that additional 3 points, average of 3 points, would have taken them into a low average range. We went on to do the PLS 5 Spanish bilingual tryout study. That had a lot more children. 200 children were tested, ages 2 through 7. And we looked at typically developing kids. 166 of those children were typically developing children, and 34 children were diagnosed with a language disorder. The children in the language disorder study were either diagnosed with a moderate to severe language disorder on a standardized test, and that could be a low score in either receptive or expressive language, as well as both, or we would accept the diagnosis from a bilingual speech-language pathologist who used non-standardized test results. So they may have done a language sample dynamic assessment or their own evaluation. And the child needed to currently be enrolled in language therapy. This just shows the average age of the children and the breakdown of the non-typically developing group was most of them had both an expressive and receptive language disorder. The method that we used here was all the items on PLS 5 Spanish were administered in Spanish first, a ceiling was obtained, and then only the items missed in Spanish were re-administered in English. So we did not re-administer the entire test in English. Items were scored based on Spanish performance only, and then looking at taking into account both Spanish and English for a dual language score. And we conducted some analyses looking at these scores. What we saw was that dual language scoring was especially significant or beneficial for children rated ages 4 through 7-11. So it was strongly related to proficiency in English, which makes a lot of sense. If the child was rated by the parents as only speaking a little English, then re-administering items in English, they did get higher scores, but just a few items. If the child spoke English and Spanish fluently, they tended to get more items correct in English, so their scores were higher. There was no relationship to caregiver educational level, so it didn't matter whether the caregivers had only less than a high school education or whether they had a college degree. We saw the same gains across all of those education levels. And there also was no relationship during the tryout study to whether or not the child was typically developing. All children showed some gains, although you'll see when we talk about the standardization results, typically developing children get much higher gains than a child with a disorder. For the children that we tested in tryout, ages 2 to 3-11, these children are still early in the acquisition process. They did have some skills in English that they didn't have in Spanish, but you didn't see the same jump in scores as you would see with the older children. Children with typical language development showed equal gains in academic and non-academic language, and what we mean by that is PLS is a developmental assessment and looks at a wide range of skills. The children with typical language development showed that increase in skills across both items that were pre-literacy activities or the integrated language skills where they had to do analogies, categories, as well as just item labeling or concept development. Children with language disorders showed greater gains in non-academic language, so social language skills and morphosyntactic skills. In the standardization, the dual language study that we conducted included children who were primarily Spanish speakers with some English abilities and bilingual Spanish-English speakers. So our standardization did not include children who only spoke a little Spanish. And the reason we point this out is because we have questions from clinicians who they have a referral for a child who's referred as a Spanish speaker. They start testing with PLS 5 Spanish and find out that he really doesn't speak much Spanish. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, about what you might consider doing with those children. We did look at length of time that the children lived in the U.S. Most of the children in our standardization had been with families who had lived in the U.S. for more than 5 years. So we only had about, 17% of children who had been in the country for a limited amount of time. And so you'll need to keep that in mind also when a child comes into your room to be assessed, whether or not you think the tests and the scores are appropriate for that child. Okay, so the normative sample, we looked at 3 different age groups. For the very young children, you'll see that, let me show you here, if I can use this markup tool correctly. Okay, this line here shows children who are monolingual Spanish speakers. And you see, of course, their skills stay flat because they don't have skills in English, so their score doesn't increase. These are the children here, and if I can get my little arrow to move, children who spoke primarily Spanish but spoke a little English, and you would see an increase in scores. These were for the typically developing children 0 to 2. These are for the bilingual children. This line here shows the bilingual children on auditory comprehension. That from ages 0 to 2 years, you would see much more of an increase in the auditory comprehension score when you take into account both languages. You see less of an increase for this age group on the expressive communication subtest. A lot of these kids were not talking. And on the total language score, you see the same kind of pattern as auditory comprehension with a bigger jump for the children who are bilingual. At ages 3 to 5, you see a similar pattern. The expressive communication scores really jumped up higher for the Spanish-speaking 3 to 5-year-olds on expressive communication. And the same kind of patterns show up again for children ages 6 to 7. These are mostly typically developing kids, as this is a standardization sample. It does include children who have been identified as a disorder. It's a very small percentage, and those kids all appear at the very bottom of our normative range. When we look at matched bilingual and monolingual samples, these are samples where we look at children who are monolingual Spanish speakers matched to children who are bilingual Spanish speakers by age and socioeconomic status, which for us we use parent education level as a proxy for that. When you do a matched sample of these kids, there's less of a difference for the infants and toddlers. Much more of a difference and this previous slide kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about for very young children, there's just not as much of an advantage of using the dual language assessment. Once you get to age 3, though, you do see that there's quite a difference in scores. So these are the children who are monolingual Spanish speakers, and their scores. These kids in the United States, monolingual Spanish speakers tend to be a little bit more of a low SES sample than the bilingual sample. And now these are matched on that basis, but you'll still see a little bit of a gap here below 100. the 3 to 5-year-olds who are typically developing in the standardization sample show a big increase in scores. And the same pattern again for 6 and 7-year-olds. We looked at children with a disorder, and what we saw was that you still see a gain in scores, but it's not as sharp a rise as it was for the typically developing children. These are the matched clinical and non-clinical samples. So these are our clinical kids down here, and you see they're scoring uniformly quite low, and there's a little bit of a gain, slight increase, but very slight. These are the typically developing children. Their scores, of course, tend to hover much higher, and there's a little bit more of an increase. That was receptive language disorder, only this is for the expressive language disorder, same pattern. And when you look at receptive and expressive skills, big gap between typically developing and children with a disorder, and when matched by age and SES, you see it's not such a sharp increase as the entire standardization sample, but there is much more of an increase compared to the children with a disorder. Overall, what we saw as a result of standardization is that while you do see some effect of dual language scoring below age 3, there's not as much of an increase as you see with older children. Dual language scoring does significantly raise the average scores of bilingual children. So children who primarily speak Spanish but know some English had a smaller increase than children who have a lot of skills in English. And dual language scoring does not appreciably affect the scores of children with language disorders, but you should still, of course, assess English so that you can determine what kind of abilities the child does have in one language or the other. And it also helps you differentiate between, or help assist you in determining whether the child has a disorder or is typically developing and just exhibiting normal phenomena of language acquisition. Marie's going to go over the dual language administration and scoring in more detail.
Yes, good morning to everybody. We'll be talking now about the dual language administration and scoring. So the first thing I have to tell you is that when you're administering the PLS 5 Spanish edition, you have to administer all items in Spanish first until you reach a ceiling, and then you will administer the English sub-items that the child had difficulty in Spanish. Then if you look at the next slide. Okay, great. When you test young children, items are administered in Spanish only or in both languages at the same time if it's necessary. For example, on item 14, you'll see that the instructions or the verbal output is provided in Spanish and it's also provided in English. You don't have to play with the child twice in order to elicit the skill. You will administer the item in both languages if necessary at the same time. For example, if you look at the next slide. No.
Oh, sorry, Marie. I can't.
On items 16 and 17 through 18, actually, then starting at age 2, you will have to administer first the items in Spanish, and once you reach the ceiling on the Spanish side, then you come back to items 14 through 16 through 18 if it's necessary, and administer in English. Are the English items from PLS 5 Spanish items that are from the PLS 5 English edition? And the answer for that is some of the items may be similar from the ones that you'll find in the English edition. However, most Spanish items were translated to English and do not correspond to items in the English version. And you have some examples there. For example, on item 29, identifying body parts, you will see that the items in Spanish are translated to English and are pretty much the same items that you're measuring. However, there are items in PLS 5 Spanish that are not an exact translation of this. There are some English items in the PLS 5 Spanish that are not an exact translation of the Spanish item. If you look at item 28, you will see that because of the different syntax and grammar in Spanish and English, you'll see that we have different, we measure different skills or different language structures in that particular item. In addition, you will find some of the items that can only be administered in Spanish. An example of this one is on item 54, using the subjunctive mood. There's no subjunctive mood in English. Consequently, you don't have to administer that one in English. It's just in Spanish. Other items will measure the same skill, but using different words that are more appropriate for each language. Example, this one is on 58 for the expressive communication scale, deleting sounds. You will have the same skill measure, however, the words that are used are completely different in English. These are questions that we have received from current users, and this one particular one says, a monolingual Spanish speaker just takes the Spanish test items. How do I administer and score PLS 5 Spanish as a dual language assessment for a child who is a bilingual Spanish-English speaker? So first administer all Spanish items until you reach a ceiling in Spanish. Then score only those items, as you see on item 29. You will see that the child did not pass did not pass the scoring criteria, which was 4 or more correct. The child obtained only 3 correct. Then continue and do all the Spanish items until you reach a ceiling. You will on item 39. You will see also that the child did not meet the passing criteria for scoring a 1 there. So you will check the administer in English, and once you're done and obtain a ceiling in Spanish, then you're going to come back and administer in English. As you see, you're going to administer in English those sub-items that the child had difficulty with and did not meet the passing criteria. If you look at them, you're going to only administer those items that the child had difficulty. And if you look at item 30, on the right side where the English version is, you will see that the child obtained the score for shoes in English, not in Spanish, and consequently, the child had 3 and meet the passing criteria, scoring a 1 on that particular item. Same thing with the one with the item before that one. What happens if I don't get a basal in Spanish? Do I try to establish a basal using the English items? You continue trying to obtain a basal in Spanish by going backwards to the previous starting point. Then after you obtain the basal and a ceiling, then come back to the English and administer only the sub-items that were missed in Spanish. What if I'm administering the test item in Spanish and the child answers in English? Where do I write the child's response on the Spanish side or the English side of the record form? As you look at the example, the test was administered in Spanish first, and the child was able to answer some of the questions in Spanish and some of them in English. You write the responses on the Spanish side because you were administering the test in Spanish. As long as the response is correct, even if it's in a different language, in English, score the item or the sub-item correct. And there's two examples there. On AC 31, recognizes actions in pictures. The verb tense used in Spanish is present tense, enséñame al que duerme, but the English version of that item uses the present progressive form of the verb. Show me the one who is sleeping. Why did the verb tense change on the English version of the test item? We pretty much consulted with a panel of experts and users, and all of them recommended that the present tense of verbs in Spanish elicits a better response when measuring the recognition of action in pictures. In English, it was recommended that the present progressive elicited better results for the same item. Some other questions that we have received are related to the administer items in Spanish, English, or both. It says, do I administer English items if the child is a monolingual Spanish speaker? And the simple answer is a no. You don't have to administer English if the child does not speak any English. How do I find out if the child is a bilingual Spanish-English speaker? Well, the most important thing is to check the review the referral data, talk to teachers and find out what the child is using in the classroom, in formal and in informal situations. Talk to the parents too. They could provide you another piece of information there. Also, another way to obtain information is by interacting with the child when you first meet the child and see what language the student is most comfortable with. What if the child's records indicate he or she primarily speaks Spanish at home, but I find that the child mostly speaks English when I'm testing? Well, you are going to conduct a dual language administration first. There may be concepts that the child may not know in one language, but in the other language. Example of that is simple household items. Children may know them in their native language, and some other more abstract or academic vocabulary, they may understand it in the second language, which could be an example of colors, shapes, and positions. Do I administer the test in 1 or 2 sessions? You can administer in 1 or 2 sessions. It depends on the child. If the child is tired or distracted, you may want to stop the administration and continue at a later time. Another question that we have received is regarding some school districts actually use, or private agencies use one therapist to administer Spanish tests, and then they use another clinician to administer English testing. Do we have to use 2 therapists with the PLS 5 Spanish? I'm going to let Nancy answer that one.
One of the people that we talked to in one district said that's their typical procedure, and they were very comfortable doing that. One of the reasons that we developed the dual language assessment is so that it would be a more efficient, more appropriate administration than having 2 separate test sessions and 2 separate examiners and administering 2 complete separate tests. So if you have the way the test was standardized was with a single examiner administering the Spanish first and then the English. And certainly if your group handles it a different way, you could continue to do that. But we we set it up this way because most clinicians felt it would be most efficient for a single therapist to do the Spanish first and the English.
How do I report the scores? Do I report Spanish only scores and dual language scores? Now you will only report one score.
In the data that I showed you, we looked at the Spanish-only responses and compared them to dual language scores for research purposes, but we only report one set of norms, and the reason for that is there's actually very, very small mean differences between the scores of monolingual Spanish speakers and bilingual Spanish speakers. And that's probably just an artifact of children in the United States, because in general they tend to be two rather separate groups. The monolingual kids tend to be lower SES kids. Bilingual kids tend to be higher SES kids. Even though qualitatively their responses might be somewhat different, their total scores, the mean scores tend to be rather close. The monolingual children tend to do much better on the items on PLS that look at morphosyntax. The bilingual kids tend to do better on the items that look at concepts. So reporting a whole separate set of norms actually wouldn't have been too useful. They're well within the confidence bands of each other, and there are actually only a couple of standard score point differences between the two. So there's only one set of scores that you report. Now you can, when you report those scores, you can indicate that the child was a monolingual Spanish speaker and only took the items in Spanish, or if the child was bilingual, that he took both groups of items, but you don't have a separate set of scores.
How do I score code switching for the item combining words? As long as the forms or skills being measured are the same in both languages, you may score that item or sub-item correct. If a child is not in a bilingual classroom, does he or she learn elision in Spanish? We got input from several clinicians, and we found out that even in bilingual classrooms and dual language classrooms, that skill is taught in the dual language and bilingual classrooms. So it is. My district wants to know if I need to purchase both the PLS 5 English and the PLS 5 Spanish, since the Spanish version is a dual language test. Yes, you will need the PLS 5 English for your English-only students and those whose primary language is English too. Some people have also questioned if the child, if we can use the items on the English to evaluate the child if the child is primarily English. What we suggested is because the child may be exposed to two languages at the same time in the environment of the home, or even grandparents or cousins or any other environment. It is recommended that once you find out that, you may want to finish the dual language testing, as with the PLS 5 Spanish, and then administer the English version in its entirety, so you know, and you have a good measurement of the English language skills.
One of the things you're not able to do, and I don't know if that was clear, but it would not be appropriate to use the English items on the PLS 5 Spanish for an English-speaking child. The standardizations on which those scores are based resulted in scores that are very different from the English version. And I know a lot of districts check because they think, oh good, this is a single test that includes both English and Spanish. But the English standardization looks at U.S. Census figures. It's demographically very different from the demographics on the PLS 5 Spanish standardization sample. Here's the list of references that you'll have in your handouts. If you have additional questions, or if you want more information, you can go to our website at psycor.com and look for PLS 5 Spanish or the PLS 5 Spanish screening test. You can also send questions to www.speechandlanguage.com if you have specific questions about any of the information we presented today, or send an email to either me or Marie. And looks like there are some questions, so we'll go over those. So hang on just a second because I want to scroll through. Oh, someone asked what the criteria was for classification of bilingual or primarily Spanish speaker. It was a combination of parental report and clinician confirmation. So the bilingual speech pathologists who participated in the studies, and there were about 300 people all across the United States and in Puerto Rico who collected cases for us, and that information was obtained from the clinicians who participated in the studies. They completed the form that indicated what the language environment was like for the child, which we collected that information even though that really didn't seem to affect scores. So it didn't really seem to matter whether a child was totally immersed in a Spanish-speaking environment or whether they just had a grandmother who spoke only Spanish to them. Their scores tended to be the same. We also asked clinicians to rate the child's language of comprehension skills and asked the parents who brought the child in for testing how much English the child spoke, understood and spoke. And I know that in a clinical environment, you'll often have parents who talk about their children having a lot of English skills or a lot of Spanish skills, and that doesn't appear to be the case. We were able, once we looked at each of the protocols that came in, we did identify some protocols that, even though both the parent and the clinician felt that the child spoke sufficient Spanish, that the child responded to almost none of the questions in Spanish, and those protocols were deleted from the standardization sample. We have a question. Instead of administering the PLS in Spanish and then the PLS in English, you could use the PLS 5 Spanish edition only to evaluate both languages. And the answer to that is yes, as long as the child is a Spanish-speaking child. So if the child is an English speaker only, you cannot use the PLS 5 Spanish English items. But if the child speaks mostly Spanish or speaks Spanish only, then you can administer both the English and Spanish items on PLS 5 Spanish and get a single score. And sorry, we're just looking through the rest of the questions to see. So there's a question: is the dual language administration valid for English dominant bilingual children? Gosh, not really. You're going to end up with a very quick ceiling, and we didn't actually include any of those children. If they were identified as English dominant but knew a little Spanish, we did not include them in the standardization sample. If they're English dominant, they really should take the English edition of PLS. Of course, on that test, they won't get the advantage of a dual language scoring unless they respond in English and you accept those answers as being conceptually the same, but you wouldn't be able to re-administer items that they don't know on the PLS English version. You wouldn't re-administer those in Spanish and then get a score because the test wasn't standardized that way. Oh, which standardized score? There's a question about which standardized score do I use, the score that is higher. I'm not sure if you could describe a little bit more what, there's only one score on the PLS 5 Spanish. So if the child is bilingual, you don't stop with just the Spanish administration and you don't score just the Spanish administration. You go on to administer the missed items in English and use only that score. Is there? We have another question. Is there an instance where you would administer English items beyond the Spanish ceiling? Yes, that does happen, and especially if the child is at an age where you're starting to hit a lot of the academic or pre-literacy items. So the child may go on and get additional items correct. You establish a second ceiling in English, and I'm glad you asked that question because we didn't mention that at all. What if I get a dual basal, one in Spanish and one in the dual language administration? What do I use? You really shouldn't get you don't establish a second basal on the Spanish, on the English. You start in Spanish and you establish a basal on Spanish and then a ceiling, and then you go back to the missed items only. You don't try to establish a second basal in English. You just go back to the missed items in Spanish and then continue to reach a ceiling. This is a good question because we hear it a lot. What if a program wants to track children's Spanish language development separately from total language development? Does the PLS-5 work for this purpose? You know, PLS-5 wasn't developed at all as a proficiency measure. So I'm not sure that, and I know that's an interest of certain programs to look at how would the child score Spanish if only the Spanish was taken into account. But since you're not re-administering all the items in English, you're only administering missed items, you won't have a separate English-only score unless you went to the PLS-5 English, and that seems like a lot of testing to make a determination that doesn't have much validity, since the test wasn't put together that way. We got another question. Are we allowed to report scores if the test is administered by an English-speaking SLP but using a Spanish-speaking interpreter? Yes, the assumption is that that's a practical reality in clinical settings, that an English-speaking SLP would train and supervise a Spanish-speaking interpreter to do the test. So, yes, that would be a valid administration, assuming that interpreter was appropriately trained to administer PLS items. That's usually easier for an interpreter to administer the items for older children who are looking at stimulus pictures or responding to questions. It's a lot harder to train an interpreter to do an assessment for a very young child. There's a section in Chapter 2 that's devoted to, that has a lot of information about working with interpreters and cites references for books and chapters and textbooks devoted specifically to that. Could you address the articulation screener section? That is not done as a dual language assessment. The articulation screener is short. It's only in Spanish. There are criterion scores based on the performance of children in the standardization sample, so they're research-based criterion scores, but they're only for looking at the child's articulation in Spanish. Is there sensitivity and specificity information available for this assessment? Yes. And unfortunately, I did not bring the manual with me because I don't remember offhand. If we can post that, we'll post the answer to that question on the PLS-5 Spanish site. When you go to the www.psycor.com, if you search for PLS-5 Spanish, there's a section for frequently asked questions. My assumption is that it's in the 80s, which is typical of assessments that are that look at language behaviors, and especially language behaviors of very young children where there's a wide range of ability. In addition, one of the reasons that specificity and sensitivity wouldn't be in the high 90s is that we take the diagnostic criteria used by clinicians in their settings. So for some children, they're identified at -1.5 standard deviations. Other kids are not identified until they're at -2 standard deviations. So depending on what criteria you use to look at sensitivity and specificity, some of the kids submitted by clinicians testing in their district would or would not be included, are identified as a language disordered child when you use a different criteria. Someone asked if we could send the submitted questions and a description of the responses. Actually, what we'll do is we will post them all on the PLS5 product page on Psycore.com, and so we'll put the responses. I would look for those in a couple of weeks. Someone asked, you made mention there wasn't much difference between the Spanish-only and dual language administration. Therefore, only one standardization table is provided. No, there's not much difference between not between the Spanish-only and dual language administration, because those scores are different, but the norms, the overall norms are not different. That was for Spanish-dominant children. So I don't think those standard scores would be valid for English-dominant bilingual children. That's correct. I expect there would be a bigger difference for these children. We are still interested in the Spanish language ability of bilingual the Spanish language ability of bilingual English-dominant children. Do you think those standard scores are valid for these children? No. That's the short, quick answer. Those scores are not based on English-dominant Spanish-speaking children. Got that one. And I'm sorry I wasn't looking at the time. But I'll wait a few minutes to see if we've missed any. If the ceiling changes after administering the failed items in English, do you still keep the Spanish ceiling or try to get a ceiling in English? If you're administering English items, then you don't use the Spanish ceiling for anything. You count all the correct answers you can from the Spanish, and then you add all the correct answers from the English that you've administered until you reach a ceiling. So if, hopefully that answers your question, so let me know if that wasn't really what you were asking. There's a question, is there a video of someone giving a PLS5 in Spanish available to view? That answer is simple, too. No, we don't have a video of a dual language administration right now, but that's a great idea. So we'll go consider that. Someone asked, when testing and there are alternate words listed by the item, is it okay to retest the sub-item with the alternate word and consider it correct? Or once it is missed, we move on? I know that it's really hard in a lot of settings that you're not there with the parent, so you're not able to go over the record form to verify vocabulary. If you try it with one word and you don't think that's the right word and you want to switch to another one, I think that's fine. Just administer it then, re-administer it then. Really the point is to find out exactly what the child knows. Now, if you're not sure and there are 5 alternates, I'm not sure it would be a great administration of that item to start checking every alternate of banana that there is in that item. But certainly for most of those, if you think there's another one that the child might understand, you could just re-administer that item then. We have a question. Since you can go beyond the ceiling the child obtained in Spanish, why not administer to bilingual but English-dominant students? It's not standardized that way. It's not standardized that way. So the scores that are on there, you can certainly administer it and to get qualitative information about that student, qualitative and descriptive information about that student that you can use to share with parents and teachers for program planning. You just can't use the normative scores. There were no children in our sample that were identified as English dominant. Or let's put it that way, the ones who were identified as English dominant were not included in the sample. We have a question. Instead of administering the PLS in Spanish and then the PLS in English, you could use the PLS 5. Oh, sorry. We've already gone over that one, only to evaluate both languages. Then she has, oh yeah, we do need to talk about CEUs. The address that you send your CEU information to is Darlene Davis, Darlene, D-A-R-L-E-N-E, Davis, D-A-V-I-S, Pearson Assessment, 19500 Bulverde Road, B-U-L-V-E-R-D-E, San Antonio, Texas, 78259. One more question and then we'll wrap it up. Will you be piloting similar studies for the SELF-4 in Spanish? Yes. Actually, we'll at some point do a language assessment of the SELF-5, something we're not looking forward to at the moment because that's a huge test. And to do a dual language assessment will be a long form for a standardization version. But yes, that's the plan. We thank you all for listening in. If you want to obtain ASHA CEUs, we just want to remind you that you need to download the forms and submit both the participant form and the course evaluation. The forms need to be postmarked by September 19th. Any forms that we receive after that date, we will be unable to submit to ASHA for CEUs. And if you're, just a reminder, if you're listening to a recorded version, there are no CEUs available. Any other questions that you have, if you can send them to www.speechandlanguage.com. We'll be glad to answer those, and we'll post the answers to the questions asked during this session on Scicor.com, PLS5 Spanish.
I want to repeat the address again.
The address again is Darlene Davis, Pearson Assessment, 19500 Bulverde, B as in boy, U-L-V as in Victor, E-R-D-E, Road, San Antonio, Texas, 78259. And if you visit the link at www.speechandlanguage.com, that's on your handout, that'll get you to the right place to download the form. Thank you very much for participating. Have a good afternoon.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the webinar for today. We thank you for your participation and ask that you please